EU ihren sicherheitspolitischen Kompass?
Does the EU have to readjust its strategic compass? Should it? That's a question we want to address in our second panel. And the German Council presidency has given a clear answer to this. They said we need a strategic compass, has triggered a multi-year process aimed towards a strategic compass for security and defense policy to be worked out by the member states. The compass touches on the very aspects we've heard about in the last panel. It's about strategic sovereignty, strategic autonomy, and defining those concepts and getting towards a shared strategic culture. And this compass very much has a Franco-German dimension. As we've heard earlier, the German presidency has kicked off this process. However, as part of the French Council presidency, the process will be concluded, and this will in fact be just a few months prior to presidential elections in France. So as it is, we're at the beginning of this process. The member states have begun discussing this, and now we are wondering, what can the expectations be that we can direct at this compass? What can we expect? And what are the areas where Germany and France need to get a bit closer together also in terms of strategic culture? So these are the questions we want to discuss in the next 45 minutes. We have experts here who represent both countries' parliaments and leading think tanks. And we did have a bit of a change in our program. You may have seen Françoise Dumas listed in our agenda. Unfortunately, she had to cancel at short notice, but we have a wonderful replacement. We have Sabine Thiele here, who is president of the European Affairs Committee of the Assemblée Nationale, and she's also a member of the Defense Committee. Bonjour. Yes, bonjour, can you hear me? Yes, we can, very well, thank you. And then from the German Federal Parliament, we have Wolfgang Helmich, who is chairman of the Defense Committee of the Bundestag and also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO. Welcome, Mr. Helmich. A wonderful good day, welcome, and thank you for your invitation. Unfortunately, the host has switched off my video, which explains why you cannot see me. I've been cut off, as it were. We can hear you all the better, though, and there you are. We can see you now. Well, thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to take part in this discussion. And then representing the think tank side of things, we have Dr. Jana Puljarin, head of the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. But not only does she work for a think tank working on German and French political issues, she also worked in the German parliament, also regarding question of disarmament. Hello, and great to have you here. And last but not least, Bruno Tertre, who is Deputy Director at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. And amongst other things, he's an expert in geopolitics and military strategy and transatlantic relationships. So when it comes to major geopolitical questions, he has a lot of experience. He's written more than 10 books, if I'm right. Bonjour.
Bonjour, Nicole.
Bonjour.
Yes, hello. Right, and at this point, before we get started with our panel, we do have translation in all 3 languages for our panel. You can choose the language. There's a globe shown at the bottom of your screen, and you can choose the language. The panelists can choose to speak one of the 3 languages, and participants can pose questions in our chat. And during our discussion, I'll also include those questions. But why don't we begin with the question of expectations that can be directed at the strategic compass? As we've heard, we're still at the beginning of this process, and our expectations are comparatively high regarding a joint strategy. At the same time, there is a bit of concern that this may end up just being another piece of paper and that agreement cannot be reached. Let me begin with Ms. Thiele. When Germany started off this idea of the strategic compass, there was some skepticism initially on the French side. Why was that the case and why has it changed? Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Nicole Koenig, for having invited me. I believe today we are looking at a question that leads us to having to ask, are we joined by fate or are we competitors? And I believe clearly that specific measures, pragmatic measures, is what needs to be put on the table to allow us to make progress. I thought the question that you asked was very interesting. Should the European Union readjust its strategic compass? Because after all, it must be said that there isn't such a thing as a strategic compass yet. For years, the European Union has been trying to define a European strategy, at least since 2016. And there has been a lot of work coordinating things with the member states. The High Representative started this at the time, but maybe the approach chosen at the time was a bit too general in nature. I believe now we have to see how we can move to an operational level. From the failure of the global strategy of 2016, we can learn, and we should see what can be learned as regards security and defense. Today, we need joint defense structures, and the language of Europe is a translation, as was said earlier, but it's not about translating words alone. It's about an intercultural translation. What is it that people understand when certain words are used, such as strategic autonomy and so on and so forth? And the armaments industry or the defense industry, as others might put it. The German ambassador in Paris said that this was in fact a good example. What Germans are hearing here is industry, and what the French people here is defending our interests. And this is something, in fact, where we have to reach agreement. There are 4 pillars, including partnership, resilience, crisis management, and so on. And it certainly would be important to realize where those crises are taking place in order to then possibly find our way to consensus, so as to also get active on an operational level. That is to ask ourselves how difficulties when it comes to an operational alignment can be overcome. That's central from my point of view, given the current situation. Also, if you look at the tactical groups, they've been around for 15 years, but they've never been deployed. So how does this lend credibility to the European Union when it comes to defending its security? Sahel, for instance, if you don't have anyone on site, you need to be present on site. And that is why this strategic compass definitely must find an answer to this question. It is not to be left with an analysis of the threats regarding the position vis-a-vis Turkey, for instance. Is that something that's very important for France? Certainly we don't always agree, but certainly we can find complementary positions. NATO does have this complementary character. No one is calling that into question, but here too, we have a situation that defending European space is something that is not possible without NATO. However, dealing with crises where European interests are concerned is something where we may want to begin to rely on our own capabilities. this French-German couple, well, makes me think of Jean-Claude Juncker. German-French cooperation has resulted in a lot of frustration with other member states if and when it works, and when it's not working, frustration can turn into pain, which is why we have to make more progress regarding this dialogue. We have to create innovative projects, and in the interests of the European Union, we have to manage to work things out also regarding the aircraft. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I have to switch my translation channel. Thank you very much. Thank you for having pointed out the issue of the global strategy, and that things may have been too vague, and that we have to focus more specifically on individual topics, two of which you have mentioned, which we'll also talk about: the question of interventions, of operations, for instance, in Sahel and the defense industry. But before we do that, let me pass the floor to Mr. Helmich and ask him, what are your expectations regarding this compass? Do you agree with Ms. Tillet's view? And what do you expect also as regards the French Council presidency? Well, I do hope you can hear me well enough. The process, or the proposal of embarking on such a process, was the result of a very bitter realization, which was that the question of the European agreement regarding defense and security policy had not been characterized by agreement regarding Europe. So the beginning of the process really was to, first of all, arrive at a shared understanding of the threat situation, and not only of the threat situation, but also of the challenges which Europe is facing, and to also arrive at a shared view of these challenges. That was a very important prerequisite, so as to be then able to work on shared strategies. As part of NATO, we also spoke about a 360 degrees view of the threats. And that also meant that in Europe, the individual member states had a different view of the threat situation. France had more of a focus on Africa. Others were focused more towards the east. Countries in the north were looking more towards the Atlantic, and bringing those views together in order to derive a European strategy was what had to be done. And the shared strategy in turn then also resulted in the 4 baskets and 4 fields of action: partnerships, crisis management, resilience are some of these fields of action in which these strategies will be rolled out. These have been identified as elements of the strategic approach, and there are European projects that exist. CARD, PESCO, the European Defense Fund are all examples of this. And these practical fields of action, however, cannot just be collected. More needs to be done, and that is being done. That is the purpose of this process, and this will then also be reflected in capability planning ultimately. Thank you, Mr. Helmich. Thank you also for having mentioned the threat assessment or analysis. I believe that was the first starting point, saying we have to agree on what the threats are. We have to assume a 360-degree view. Now, the next question to Bruno Tertre, we have this 360 degrees analysis. It's very broad. Now, how can we get to what Mr. Helmich has mentioned, to what we have defined as part of these individual baskets? I believe we should recall that a joint strategy does not necessarily have to be a uniform strategy, same as the common currency is not a uniform currency. Citizenship, defense, these are areas where we will never be able to agree on a single position with all members of the European Union. It is a very useful exercise to embark upon. However, I believe at the European level, other things can be more useful, not once they exist, but if they have triggered a debate in the first place. The current example, I believe, illustrates that this is the case. And frequently, not in all cases, but frequently what we see happening is that the first version, or rather the final version, looks fairly smooth or well done, but things need to be clarified by the member states. For instance, things such as a relationship with Turkey, with Russia. Now, I'm a Frenchman, and you may expect me to start talking about Israel and Sahel next, and I'm sure I'll get there. However, I believe that the priorities that require clarification are such priorities where we have major partners with whom we have problems. Turkey, for instance, first of all. The second aspect is we have to take this very far, and we have to dig deep. Taking it far is to say that this compass is something that also must cover and address our interests in the Indo-Pacific area, and going deep also means that we have to take into account aspects such as cyberspace and space, and not only the Earth's geography, because that is what we're thinking about when we're talking about the famous 360 degrees in a NATO context. 360 degrees, well, a compass with 360 degrees will not point you in any direction. So it will be very difficult to set priorities in Europe, which is not to say that we should not try to put at least a number of them on the list. Maybe so much for the time being, and maybe Nicole, you'll have more specific questions as we move along.
Yes, thank you very much. And obviously, what you indicated is very important, but then again, such a document also wouldn't be indicated in a very clear approach. As Bruno said quite rightly, it might be highly diluted and nothing truly efficient or effective might be in it. What, from your point of view, would be the do's and don'ts to avoid that, Jana? Although, of course, the process is part of the way, actually. Thank you, Nicole. I believe the compass needs to fulfill three objectives mostly. It needs to clarify which kind of actor the EU wants to be when it comes to security and defense policy. Actually, I'm quite in agreement with Wolfgang Helmich. It is quite sad to state that right now in 2021, many years after the declaration of Saint-Malo and the start of the common defense and security policy, we still don't have answers to those questions, but we don't. There are still many, many views what European defense and security policy should do, what the focus points should be. There's no clarity about the how, the who, with, the when, and the means which are to be used. And for that alone, I believe, if the member states really try to achieve a compromise and try to arrive at a joint approach, that then such a compass would help a lot. Secondly, to me, this compass, through this process alone, may help develop such a joint European culture. I've had the pleasure myself of being part of some exchanges, discussions to do with the strategic compass in Poland, in Paris, and all that's easily done these days when it's all virtual. So these differences alone, listening in there, illustrates how far we have yet to go, but also how interesting it can be once the states are forced to arrive at a common denominator together. And thirdly, I believe this compass has to help bridge or actually close the gap between ambition and reality. That I think is the main suffering of geopolitics at the moment, that there's such a wide gap between the European concept of the European Defense Union, the European army that is being mentioned here, and the strong role of Europe in the world, the geopolitical commission, or mission rather. But if you compare that to the current output that the Europeans get on the road, so to speak, that balance isn't too great. And I believe we need to work on both sides of that balance, both when it comes to rhetorics and also the ambition behind it, and at the same time also contributing to the reality looking better. I think the great risk is that this compact becomes a kind of Christmas tree, and every country puts on the tree what they believe is most important, and that it's overwrought with expectations. And obviously be as wide as possible. The Germans like to do that, having everybody on board with all of their points, but not shying away from the hot topics, say. And one of the very controversial topics, for instance, is the question of to what extent the EU as an actor should play a role in territorial defense, under which conditions, and whether there is a role for the EU to play at all, or whether it should be NATO only. And also the question, how, for example, to handle ad hoc missions from a coalition of the willing and to better adapt it to the framework, or how to make that framework more flexible to not make for so many ad hoc missions anymore. So it's a question of prioritizing. Everybody can say what they believe is most important, but then to be as concrete as possible in the discussion. Not make this another airy document, but rather a very concrete package presenting what over the next 5 to 10 years can actually be implemented. And that, I believe, can be a promising process and can lead to a very good result. That at least would ensure that the member states remain on board. I think that is very key, because it also illustrates the difference to the global strategy that the member states have never really accepted for themselves. Yeah, I think the concrete points of what should be discussed and the tension between ambition and reality, or realism, say. The Christmas tree, you put lots of ornaments on it and then you shake it, and all of a sudden it doesn't look that well adorned anymore. But now in the second part, I'd like to come to another aspect. Germany and France have a very important role to play. There's the strong German-French or Franco-German dimension, but it's also about them arriving at a common denominator and possibly taking others on board with topics such as territorial defense and which role the EU should play in that. And at this point, I'd like to come to a question from the chat and ask it of Sabine Tillet. Nicholas Fischerek says, is it correct that Germany wants to integrate as many national European standpoints as possible into the strategic compass, whereas France could well accept to not take into account all of the various viewpoints, but to thus arrive at a more strategic, a clearer strategic positioning of the EU? So question, is France more in favor of more concrete terms and Germany more in favor of as much inclusiveness as possible? What would you make of it? Thank you. And that really is an excellent question. To France, concrete measures are very important indeed. It's about the operative element that needs to be a very clear role, which is not to say that you cannot talk about really everything. But after that, you've got to make a selection. And Jana Puljerin said it quite rightly. We've got to see what are our objectives and what of that can be achieved. That is what we need to focus on. It's really got to be geared towards concrete measures. We saw it in the structured cooperation, SSC. Germany is quite open there to as many participants as possible, having everybody on board. That's nice and well, but I believe one also ought to look at efficiency. And efficiency might also mean that one's got to limit the whole thing a bit more again. Great, thank you. And you mentioned that before, the question of arms cooperation between Germany and France also plays a role in all of this, Wolfgang Helmich. And we've heard in past weeks, time and again, that the joint project in this respect, the joint fighter aircraft, is actually at stake at the moment, or at risk. What do you think are the hitches at the moment, and what needs to happen so that we can actually get to pursuing these longer term joint interests? And you would need to unmute yourself, Mr. Helmich. I think the differences aren't all that great anymore. They're not as substantial as they're being portrayed in the media. Since the last 2 weeks, since the Franco-German, French Security and Defense Council, a lot of work has been invested here. And I think the finalization of what can be done there jointly and what needs to be done will actually be the topic of the next tranche until the end of the legislative period, which is in June. And it should be finalized by then, because there were some findings that were painful. Questions of who gives in to whom and to what extent. And making this fit to not just 2, but 3 or more states, that also was a challenge. But if in a global framework you agree on sharing the work between companies, entities, not just states, then that's just important as the question, what about rights and skills and technical capacities? That means that a great many obstacles have been overcome so that progress can be made. It's quite right. From a German point of view, we tend to be very inclusive. There's other projects, the Tiger as well, not entirely unproblematic. And so Germany is also closely intertwined with other states, also in defense policy. The Netherlands, for example, a large ship here at state, then the submarine cooperation with Norway, a new cooperation with the Hungarian army, and mutual support when it comes to exchange of troops between, say, Netherlands and the German Federal Army. That just illustrates that we want to be broadly positioned on that. So we truly want many partners and we need many partners. And these, as I said, are interdependencies, interconnections. For example, equipping the German army without support from other nations is quite inconceivable. And that also, because then it would have to be provided by the German national defense industry alone. For the time being, we cannot replace our foreign suppliers, but if we were ever to get there, then the situation would be different, of course. Thank you, Mr. Helmich. That makes for a slightly more positive outlook than what we heard at the last panel. Sabine Thiele, do you agree to this positive outlook when it comes to joint defense projects? Well, I think it's a long way to go and it's a difficult way, but of course, it's quite right. We've made a start. And over the next weeks, I think very decisive things will happen for this Franco-German or French-German-Spanish project. It would be very dangerous indeed if we couldn't find a consensus, if we couldn't achieve a result. That really would be dangerous for European defense and security. I think we are condemned to make this a success, but I quite agree with my colleague Wolfgang Helmich, of course. I'm very happy to see him here, and I do believe that we will get it done. Thank you very much. Let's move over to a different topic, which was also part of the discussion time and again, which is always the topic to discuss when it's about differences in strategic culture, not just between all Europeans, but specifically also between Germany and France, and that's crisis management. Bruno Tertre, you just mentioned the Sahel, There have been a great many discussions on this. And again, Germany's refusal to become more involved in military terms. What do you make of this? Where would Germany need to become more involved? Where do the strategic cultures grow together more strongly when it comes to crisis management?
Je me méfie beaucoup des réponses françaises à ce type de questions.
Right, thank you.
Avons souvent tendance à être un petit peu donneurs de leçons.
Thank you for allowing me to answer this from the French perspective. Very often it is our reputation that we are happy to teach the Germans a lesson, so I'm not sure if I can answer it in that way. But let me also touch a few of the other points that were mentioned here. The very concrete results, the concrete objectives of the strategic compass. I am rather skeptical because there is nothing worse than a Europe wording very ambitious targets and then not achieving them. In the field of defense, I remember, for example, the Helsinki context. I was involved with the headline girls more than 20 years ago. I was a very young journalist, very ambitious, maybe overly ambitious. I was very much about abilities, not about capabilities, as the wording goes in English. So what can we do together? What are we able to do together? What's the general context and scope of what we can do? Not so much the technical questions, not so much the precise details, but rather in the sense of us coming out of such theological debates about concepts, talking about actual concrete questions. So to everything that's being voiced over Zoom and Twitter and elsewhere, Germany and France will always be different as countries, but I would like to underline the strategic complementariness. For example, towards Russia, we have differing standpoints, but they are rather complementary in nature than entirely different. Also, our approach when it came to Turkey was quite different last year, but both made a lot of sense in the end. Mediation through the Germans, that would be absurd, but I think France and Germany have shown approaches which, as a matter of fact, were constructive for Europe, and that was positive. As for Africa and the Sahel, I wouldn't want to sound like teaching a lesson to anybody, or if at all, rather to my own country. Since 2013, up until about 2018 maybe, for 5 years, France focused far too much on the potential terrorist threat from the Sahel, unless all of us Europeans together contributed to stabilizing the region. And I believe that wasn't a good approach, because on the one hand, it turned out that to many of our allies, that wasn't particularly convincing as a strategy. And you've got to say the key threat or risk is not the terrorist threat from the Sahel. We have a far wider risk, and that's the risk of the danger of an instability in a region which is a neighboring region of Europe, not just of France, but of Europe. Obviously, there's more French or people of French origin in that region than you would find Swedes or Finns. That goes without saying. But when we see the discussion in between Europeans, particularly between the French and the German, we've got to maybe more focus on a term that was always very important to Germany: stable neighborhood, stability in neighborly relations. Ever since unification, Germany very much advocated stable neighbors in the East, quite rightly so. And France might want to attach more importance to stable neighborhood relations in the south, not just for questions of terrorist threats. It's also about aspects of migration, quite clearly, also humanitarian questions, questions of drug trafficking and so on. So a great many aspects come into this, and I believe my country has a lesson to learn in this. Thank you very much for pointing out that a change of focus might help here, that it shouldn't be a unilateral focus, and also the strategic complementariness between the two. Before I ask Jana Puljarin another question, let me also remind our participants that you're invited to also ask questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to take them up in our discussion. We've got a bit of time left, so feel free to ask questions. Jana, to you now, the slightly wider question now again of crisis management, joint strategic cultures. We got the parliamentary reservation, of course, and for us in Germany, it's always difficult to contribute to such coalitions of the willing. And there were considerations, as you mentioned quite rightly, that possibly within the EU framework, one might want to refer to Article 44 of forging smaller coalitions or creating smaller coalitions or including them in the European framework. Do you want to elaborate on that maybe?
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to respond to Bruno, who was wonderfully critical of France. I'll try and be critical with Germany. I thought this idea of strategic complementarity was a very flattering one because in a way it also covers up some tensions, and I personally also heard that criticism in many conversations with French people, and to an extent there is something to it. If you look at what Germany is engaging itself in, especially in the Sahel region. For Germans, it was very much about training, about empowering partners in conflicts and crises, and to enable these partners to solve their problems themselves to an extent. And now Bruno didn't mention this, but I was thinking that this idea of strategic complementarism is also interpreted sometimes as a lack of willingness on the Germans to do the heavy lifting, of ducking out. And I believe that much has been happening in Germany in that regard. There are 1,000 troops within the UN mission in Mali, but still at its core, if you want to put it in a nutshell, in Sahel, France is shooting the terrorists and Germany is doing the training, which has only become possible because the French have brought about a measure of security. I believe there is such a thing as a strategic complementarity here. I just am not sure just how sustainable it can be. There have been questions directed at Germany to get involved. And that takes me to another question raised by Nicole, the idea of crisis management and the German view of things and the Franco-German French understanding of it, which can be contrasted. I think the view of Germany regarding crisis management currently is that the in the EU context, these operations have become irrelevant to an extent. If you look at the number of troops that are being deployed, the types of operations, of missions, there's been a step back that's been taken. Regression, many are not willing to work in the EU context if they more easily, flexibly, in a less complicated way can create missions outside of the EU context. And that's more easily done by the French, because in Germany, due to the basic law, there's a problem in becoming active outside of the system of collective security. And for this reason, the Germans have been trying to find a solution also in the context of the strategic compass to talk about that and to see to it that the CSDP does not cover the industrial policy aspect, but that cooperation can take place rather not on an ad hoc basis, but that there is an attempt of bringing about some flexibility within the EU context.